The heavy iron of the Beretta pressed into the soft skin beneath my jaw, the cold metal drawing a sharp contrast to the humid heat of the Sicilian basement. Dante's thumb clicked the safety off. The sound echoed off the damp concrete walls like a thunderclap. His eyes, usually the color of aged bourbon, were now shards of black glass. 6 months, Elara, he whispered, his voice a jagged blade. 6 months of sleeping in my bed, eating at my table, and carrying the name of a dead woman. He pressed the barrel harder, forcing my head back until I stared at the flickering fluorescent light above. My pulse throbbed against the steel. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the copper tang of blood from my split lip. Before the silk sheets and the blood-stained diamonds, there was only the mission. I was a ghost sent to haunt a palace of monsters, tasked with retrieving the encrypted ledger that could dismantle the Moretti empire. I had scrubbed their floors, served their wine, and eventually climbed into the lion's den itself. I had played the part of the grieving orphan so well I almost forgot the wire tucked into my corset. But the game of shadows has no winners, only survivors. If you believe Elara deserves a chance to escape the cage she built for herself, hit the like button so her story reaches the ones who can help her. I had arrived at the Moretti estate under a torrential downpour, clutching a forged recommendation letter and a suitcase full of lies. My hands stayed steady as I polished the silver in the dining hall, my ears tuned to the low murmurs of the men in the study. Dante Moretti, the heir with a reputation for spotting a lie before it was spoken, had watched me from the shadows of the mezzanine for weeks. He didn't speak, he observed. He watched the way I handled the vintage crystal, the way I never looked him in the eye, and the way I disappeared into the servants' quarters exactly at 10. The first complication arose during the 3rd month. A courier arrived with a package addressed to the woman I was pretending to be, Sofia Rossi. The real Sofia was currently buried in an unmarked grave 3 states away. I intercepted the courier at the gate, my fingers trembling as I signed the ledger. As I turned, Dante was standing 3 inches behind me. The rain soaked through my thin uniform, making the fabric cling to my skin. He didn't ask about the package. He simply reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his knuckles grazing my skin like a threat. "You have a habit of being where you shouldn't be, Sofia," Dante remarked, his gaze dropping to the package in my hand. I squeezed the cardboard until it buckled. "I was merely helping the porters, Signor," I replied, my voice a practiced silk. He stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He took the package from my hand, his fingers lingering against mine. He didn't open it. He tossed it into the mud and stepped on it, crushing the contents beneath his polished leather shoes. "The help shouldn't be so eager," he said, turning back toward the house. "It makes people wonder what they're hiding." By the 4th month I was no longer polishing silver. I was sitting at the mahogany table in the study, translating Greek shipping manifests for Dante's father, the Don. My fingers flew across the keyboard, eyes scanning for the hidden codes our analysts had described. I felt the weight of the Don's gaze on me, a heavy, suffocating pressure. He sipped his espresso, the steam curling around his silver beard. "You have a sharp mind for a girl from the docks," he grunted. I didn't look up from the screen. "Poverty is a demanding teacher, sir." The transition from translator to lover happened on a Tuesday. Dante had summoned me to the library to help organize his grandfather's collection. The room smelled of old paper and tobacco. As I reached for a heavy leather tome on the top shelf, the ladder slipped. I braced for the impact, but Dante's arms caught me before I hit the floor. He didn't let go. He held me against the shelves, his breath hot against my neck. I felt the hard line of his jaw against my temple. The ledger was 5 feet away, hidden behind a false panel in the wall. I leaned into him, my fingers tracing the outline of the holster beneath his jacket. We spent the next 2 months in a fever dream of stolen glances and silent promises. I moved into his wing of the mansion, leaving the servants' quarters behind. My wardrobe changed from gray cotton to black silk. Every night as he slept, I slipped out of bed to chip away at the safe in the study. Every morning I woke up before him, my heart a trapped bird in my chest. I was winning. I was inches away from the ledger. Then a man from my past appeared at the Moretti gala, holding a glass of champagne and a photograph that would end my life. I saw him across the ballroom, Agent Miller, my former handler who had gone rogue 3 weeks prior. He didn't signal me. He simply smiled and walked toward the dawn. My vision blurred. I looked at Dante, who was occupied with the heads of the 5 families. I had to kill the connection before Miller spoke. I grabbed a steak knife from a passing tray and followed him toward the balcony. The wind whipped my hair across my face as I stepped into the night air. Miller was waiting, leaning against the marble railing. "You look good in diamonds, Elara," he spat. "Better than you did in the academy." I didn't answer. I drove the knife toward his throat, but he caught my wrist, his grip like a vice. "The Don paid 5 million for your true name," he whispered. "I'm just here to collect." I slammed my forehead into his nose, the crunch of bone satisfying. He tumbled over the railing, a silent shadow falling into the darkness of the cliffside. I wiped the blood from my gown and turned to go back inside. Dante was standing in the doorway, the light from the ballroom casting his shadow long across the stone. He wasn't holding a drink. He was holding my burner phone, the screen glowing with a message from the agency. The silence on the balcony was heavier than the humid night air. Dante looked at the phone, then at the blood on my hands. He didn't shout. He didn't call for the guards. He walked to the railing and looked down at the spot where Miller had vanished. "He was a clumsy man," Dante said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He turned the phone over in his hands, the light catching the cracks in the screen. "But he was right about one thing. You do look better in diamonds." He took a step toward me and I reached for the small pistol tucked into my thigh holster. Dante's hand was faster. He pinned my arm to the stone, the gun clattering to the floor. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Who are you?" he demanded. I didn't answer. I spat in his face. He wiped the saliva away with his thumb, a dark smile playing on his lips. "I spent 6 months wondering why you never asked for money. Why you never asked for a ring. You were waiting for the ledger." He let go of my arm and stepped back, gesturing toward the ballroom. "It's gone, Elara. I moved it a week ago. I wanted to see how long you'd keep dancing." The revelation hit me harder than a physical blow. The 6 months of fear, the stolen nights, the blood on my hands, it was all for a ghost. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with, the man I had almost allowed myself to love. He wasn't a lover. He was a jailer who had enjoyed the show. I lunged for the fallen pistol, but the balcony doors burst open. 4 guards flooded the space, their submachine guns leveled at my chest. Dante didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on mine. "Take her to the basement," he commanded. "And bring the kit. If you believe Elara can find a way to flip the script on the Moretti family, hit the like button so her resilience isn't forgotten." The basement smelled of rust and decay. They had stripped me of the silk and the diamonds, leaving me in a thin slip that offered no protection against the cold. Dante sat on a wooden stool across from me, a leather roll of tools laid out on a table. He picked up a pair of surgical pliers, turning them over in the light. "The Don wants your head on a platter," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth I had grown used to. "He thinks you've compromised the shipping routes." I told him I'd handle the interrogation personally. He stood up and walked toward me, the pliers glinting. I didn't pull away from the chains. I stared at him, my breathing shallow. "You won't do it," I said, my voice a raspy whisper. He stopped, the tip of the pliers inches from my fingernail. "Why wouldn't I? You're a spy. A liar. A ghost." I leaned forward as much as the chains allowed. "Because you moved the ledger a week ago. You knew who I was then. If you wanted me dead, I would have been in the dirt before the gala." Dante's eyes flickered. He dropped the pliers onto the concrete floor. He grabbed my face, his fingers digging into my cheeks. "You think you're so smart? You think you've crawled under my skin?" He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. "I didn't keep you alive because I love you. I kept you alive because the Don is being watched by a rival family, and I need a scapegoat." He pulled a small key from his pocket and unlocked my right wrist. "You're going to help me kill my father tonight, Elara? Or you're going to die with him." The weight of the betrayal shifted. Dante wasn't just a monster, he was a usurper. He wanted the throne and he needed my agency training to help him take it. He unlocked the other chain and handed me a black tactical suit. "There's a silent alarm in the Don's bedroom," he explained, his voice now a low, professional hum. "The guards rotate at 2 a.m. We have a 4-minute window to clear the hallway and enter the inner sanctum. I do the killing. You do the extraction of the real ledger." I pulled the suit on, the fabric cool against my skin. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, zipping the front. Dante checked the magazine of his pistol. "You shouldn't. But I'm the only one in this house who isn't going to put a bullet in your brain the moment you walk out that door." He handed me a suppressed 9mm. "Check the safety. We move in 10. I looked at the gun, then at the man who had tricked me for 6 months. I had a choice: become an assassin for the Mafia, or die a spy in a cold basement. I clicked the safety off. We moved through the shadows of the estate like twin ghosts. Dante knew every blind spot in the security cameras, every squeaky floorboard in the grand hall. We reached the Don's wing without firing a shot. At the end of the hallway, 2 guards stood at attention. Dante signaled me. I moved left, he moved right. 2 muffled pops echoed in the corridor. The guards slumped against the wallpaper, red blooms spreading across their white shirts. Dante didn't even look at them. He stepped over the bodies and placed his thumb on the biometric scanner of the Don's door. The door hissed open. The room was dark, save for the glow of a dozen monitors on the far wall. The Don was sitting in bed, a laptop on his knees. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "I wondered when you'd grow a spine, Dante," the old man said, his voice a dry rattle. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "And the spy? I told you she was too clever for you." Dante didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and fired. The bullet hit the Don square in the forehead, his head snapping back against the headboard. The laptop slid to the floor, the screen glowing with a live feed of the basement we had just left. Dante walked to the bedside table and pulled a small, gold-encrusted flash drive from a hidden drawer. "The real ledger," he said, turning back to me. "The one your agency would kill for." He held it up, the light from the monitors reflecting off the gold. "Now we have a problem, Elara. Only one of us is walking out of this room as the hero." He turned his gun toward me. I already had mine leveled at his chest. "I figured," I said. "You were always too predictable." Dante laughed, a hollow sound in the room of death. "Predictable? I let you stay for 6 months because I wanted to see if you were as good as the file said. You're better." He took a step toward me, his gun steady. "Give me the flash drive, Elara. I'll give you a 10-minute head start." I didn't move. "I don't need a head start. I need the truth." Dante's expression softened for a fraction of a second. "The truth is I would have kept you forever if you had just been Sophia." He squeezed the trigger. The bullet grazed my shoulder, spinning me around. I fired back, my shot catching him in the thigh. He went down, his gun skittering across the hardwood. I lunged for the flash drive, my fingers closing around the cold metal. Dante grabbed my ankle, his grip like iron even as he bled. You can't run from this family," he gasped. I kicked him in the face, the sound of his nose breaking echoed in the silent room. I grabbed the gold drive and ran for the balcony. Below me the grounds were crawling with lights. The silent alarm hadn't been silent. The guards were converging on the Don's wing. I looked at the flash drive in my hand, then at the dark woods beyond the fence. I had the ledger. I had the kill. But I was trapped on a 3rd-story balcony with 60 killers closing in. If you believe Elara has one more trick up her sleeve to survive the night, hit the like button so her mission doesn't end in the dirt. I didn't jump. I climbed. I used the ivy-covered trellis to slide down to the 2nd-story ledge, my shoulder screaming in protest. The guards were shouting in the courtyard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I reached the edge of the roof and saw a black SUV idling near the gate. It wasn't a Moretti car. It was the agency. They had sent a retrieval team. I took a deep breath and threw myself off the ledge, rolling as I hit the manicured grass. Bullets tore up the sod around me as I sprinted for the fence. I felt a sharp pain in my calf, but I didn't stop. I threw the flash drive over the iron bars just as a hand grabbed my jacket. I spun around, my fist connecting with a guard's throat. He fell, but 3 more were on me. I was pinned to the grass, the cold barrels of several rifles pressing into my back. "We have the intruder," someone shouted. The gates groaned open, and the black SUV accelerated away into the night, the flash drive safe inside. They had what they wanted. I was expendable. I was dragged back into the house, my knees scraping against the gravel. They took me to the grand hall, where Dante was sitting in a velvet chair, a medic wrapping his leg. He looked at me, his face a mask of dried blood and fury. The Don's body was being carried out in a black bag. Dante stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. "She threw it," he said to the men around him. "She gave the ledger to the feds." He walked toward me, the tip of his cane clicking against the marble. He stopped in front of me and gripped my chin, forcing me to look at him. "You've destroyed 60 years of history for a paycheck," he hissed. I laughed, a bloody sound that bubbled in my throat. "It wasn't for the paycheck, Dante. It was for the girl you buried to make me Sophia." He struck me across the face, the world spinning into darkness. When I woke up, I was in the back of a van, my hands tied with zip ties. The air was cold and smelled of salt. We were at the docks. Dante was standing at the edge of a pier, the moonlight reflecting off the water. He watched as 2 men hauled a heavy concrete block toward me. "The agency won't come for you, Elara," he said. "They have their drive. You're just a loose end." He walked over and knelt beside me, his eyes searching mine. "I'm going to give you a choice. One final choice. He pulled a small knife from his belt and held it to my zip ties. "Tell me the encryption key for the drive. If you do, I'll put you on a boat to South America. If you don't, you go in the harbor." I looked at the water, then at the man who had been my everything and my nothing for 6 months. The key wasn't a number. It wasn't a word. It was the melody of the song I had hummed to him every night in bed. The song he had called his favorite. I looked him in the eye and whispered the title of the song. He froze. The knife trembled in his hand. He realized then that I had been telling him the truth the entire time, hidden in plain sight. He stared at me, the realization breaking across his face like a wave. The silence on the dock was broken only by the lapping of the waves against the wooden pilings. Dante's hand stayed on the knife, but he didn't cut the ties. He looked at his men, then back at me. He was a Moretti. He had a reputation to uphold. But he was also a man who had been haunted by a ghost for 6 months. He stood up and turned away from me. "Throw her in," he commanded. The 2 men grabbed my shoulders and hauled me toward the edge. I felt the weight of the concrete block as they pushed me over the side. The cold water hit me like a physical blow, dragging me down into the darkness. I held my breath, my lungs burning as the surface light faded. Then I felt a hand on my arm. A knife cut through the zip ties. A pair of lungs pressed against mine, pushing air into my mouth. It was Dante. He had jumped in after me. He cut the rope to the concrete block and kicked toward the surface, dragging me with him. We broke the surface behind a stack of shipping containers, away from the eyes of his men. He shoved me toward a small motorboat idling in the shadows. "Go," he wheezed, blood coughing from his lungs. "If I ever see you again, I'll kill you myself." I climbed into the boat, my body shaking with cold. I looked at him, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. "Why?" I asked. He didn't answer. He simply pushed the boat away from the pier and watched as I disappeared into the fog. I spent the next 3 months in a small village in the Swiss Alps, living under a name that wasn't Sofia or Elara. I watched the news from Italy. Dante Moretti had taken his father's place, the transition of power described as a bloody but necessary evolution. The ledger had been cracked, but only partially. The agency had the names of the suppliers, but the offshore accounts remained locked. They didn't have the key. They didn't have the song. One evening, as I was sitting in a small cafe overlooking the valley, a man sat down at the table across from me. He didn't look like a mobster or a spy. He looked like a traveler. He placed a small, gold-encrusted flash drive on the table between us. "You forgot this," he said. I didn't look up. I knew the voice. "I thought you were dead," I said. Dante smiled, a weary, genuine expression. "I was. For 6 months I lived for a ghost. Now, I'm just a man looking for a girl who knows a song." If you think Elara and Dante's story is the beginning of something new rather than the end of something old, hit the like button so the algorithm knows this journey matters. I looked at the drive, then at him. "The agency will come for you," I warned. Dante shrugged. "Let them. They don't have the key. And the Moretti family. They think I'm on a business trip in London. We have a 4-hour head start." He reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was warm, a contrast to the mountain air. "I'm not Sofia," I reminded him. He squeezed my fingers. "I know. You're the woman who almost killed me 3 times. That's much more interesting." We walked out of the cafe together, the sun setting over the peaks. The world was still full of monsters and shadows, but for the first time in 6 months I wasn't hiding. I wasn't a ghost. I was a woman walking into the light with the man who had seen through all my lies. As we reached the car, he paused and looked at me. "Sing it for me," he whispered. "The song. I want to hear it one more time." I leaned in and whispered the melody into his ear, the notes drifting away on the wind. He smiled, and for the first time there was no threat in his eyes. Only a promise. We got into the car and drove toward the border, leaving the ghosts of Italy and the agency behind. The game was over. The music had just begun. The mountain road was a winding ribbon of gray against the vibrant orange of the sky. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the pines blur by. Dante kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other firmly laced with mine. The silence between us wasn't the suffocating pressure of the Moretti basement. It was a quiet understanding, a bridge built over 6 months of lies and a single night of truth. "Where are we going?" I asked softly. He glanced at me, the fading light catching the scars on his jaw. "Somewhere the name Moretti means nothing. Somewhere you can be whoever you want to be." We crossed the border into France as the moon climbed high, the air turning crisp and smelling of lavender. Dante pulled into a small, secluded and tucked away in a valley of vineyards. The owner, an elderly woman with eyes that had seen 1,000 secrets, handed us a single key without asking for identification. The room was small, with stone walls and a fireplace that crackled with a welcoming heat. I stood by the window looking out at the silvered vines. The weight of the flash drive in my pocket felt different now, less like a weapon and more like a bridge to a past I was finally ready to burn. Dante stepped up behind me, his presence a familiar warmth. He didn't touch me at first. He just stood there, the rhythmic sound of his breathing a steady anchor. "You still have it," he noted, his voice low. I pulled the gold drive from my pocket and held it up, the firelight dancing off the metal. "The agency thinks I'm dead. Your family thinks you're in London. This is the only thing left that connects us to them." I walked over to the fireplace and held the drive over the flames. Dante watched me, his expression unreadable. "If you drop that, there's no going back," he said. "I know," I replied. I let go. The drive hissed as it hit the glowing embers, the gold melting and the circuits curling into nothingness. The secrets of the Moretti family, the leverage of the agency, the 6 months of Sofia Rossi, it all dissolved into smoke. I turned back to Dante and for the first time I felt light. He stepped toward me, his hands finding my waist. He pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine. "The song Elara," he whispered. "The real one. Not the key. The one your mother sang." I began to sing, my voice a soft thread in the quiet room. It wasn't a song of secrets or lies. It was a simple melody, a lullaby about a bird finding its way home through a storm. Dante closed his eyes, his grip tightening as the notes filled the space between us. When I finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. He opened his eyes, and I saw a man who had finally put down his armor. "Welcome home," he whispered. We stood there in the fading light, two survivors of a war that had no name, finally finding peace in the middle of the silence. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The next morning, the sun broke over the vineyards in a burst of brilliant gold. I woke up to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of birds chirping in the ivy outside the window. Dante was already up, standing on the small balcony looking out at the valley. He looked different in the morning light, younger, less burdened. I walked out to join him, the cool air waking my senses. He turned and smiled, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waking up to a mission. I was waking up to a life. "We have a long road ahead of us," Dante said, gesturing toward the horizon. "But I think we'll make it." I took a deep breath, the scent of lavender and earth filling my lungs. I looked at the man who had been my enemy and my lover, my captor and my savior. We were no longer characters in a Mafia thriller. We were just two people moving forward one step at a time. I took his hand and together we walked back into the room to start our first real day. The ghosts were gone. The music was ours. And for once, the silence was beautiful. The morning sun didn't just bring light, it brought a cold, sharp reality. We were two of the most hunted people on the planet, standing on a balcony in Provence with nothing but a stolen car and a charred memory of a gold flash drive. Dante's hand was still wrapped in mine, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. He wasn't looking at the vineyards anymore. He was looking at the horizon, his eyes tracking a silver speck in the sky. A drone. High altitude. Not commercial. "They found the drive signal before it melted," Dante whispered, his voice losing its morning warmth. "The agency has a thermal trail on the hardware. We have 20 minutes. He didn't panic. He moved with the calculated stillness of a man who had been expecting the end since the moment he jumped into the harbor. I felt the old adrenaline spike, the familiar metallic taste of fear that I had tried to burn in the fireplace. I looked at the stone walls of the inn. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. If you believe Elara and Dante have earned their peace after everything they've sacrificed, hit the like button so their trail stays cold. We didn't take the car. Dante knew they'd have the plates scanned the moment we hit the main road. Instead, we moved through the thick rows of the vineyard, the dry earth kicking up dust against my boots. The scent of lavender was replaced by the ozone smell of approaching rain. "There's a local freight line 3 miles east," Dante said, his pace rapid despite the limp in his leg. "If we catch the 9:15 to Marseille, we can vanish into the docks. I have a contact there who owes me a life." We reached the tracks just as the steel beast began to groan past. It wasn't a passenger train, it was a line of rusted shipping containers heading for the coast. Dante grabbed a ladder on a moving car and reached back for me. I swung onto the metal, the vibration rattling my teeth. We huddled in the narrow gap between two containers as the French countryside blurred into a streak of green and gray. Dante pulled a small silver coin from his pocket, a Moretti heirloom. He flipped it, catching it with a snap. Heads, we make it to the boat. Tails, we go down fighting. He didn't show me the result. He just tucked the coin back into his vest and pulled me into the shadow of the steel wall. The rain finally broke, a torrential downpour that washed the dust from our clothes and the blood from our spirits. As the train screeched toward the Marseille harbor, I saw the flashing lights of a blockade at the perimeter. The agency wasn't just looking for a drive, they were looking for the woman who knew the song. And they weren't the only ones. A line of black SUVs sat idling by the tracks, Moretti colors. Dante, I hissed, pointing toward the SUVs. He saw them. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking. The family didn't wait for the business trip to end. They knew the moment the Don's pulse stopped. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a sudden, fierce resolve. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the map to the underground tunnels beneath the port. When we jump, you go left. I go right. Meet at the Le Vieux lighthouse at midnight. No, I said, my voice cracking against the wind. We don't split up. Not again. Dante grabbed my shoulders, his grip bruising. They want me for the throne, Elara. They want you for the grave. If we stay together, we both end up in the dirt. Go. That's an order from the man who saw through your lies. The train slowed for the bend, and before I could protest, Dante shoved me off the car into a pile of industrial sand. I rolled, the grit stinging my eyes, and looked back just in time to see him standing on top of the container, a silhouette against the gray sky, drawing the fire of the approaching guards. I ran. I didn't look back. I followed the map into the damp, salt-crusted tunnels of Marseille, my heart a drumbeat of guilt. Every gunshot that echoed from the surface felt like a needle in my skin. I reached the lighthouse at 11:55 p.m., the waves crashing against the stone base like a warning. The air was thick with fog. I waited. 1 minute. 5. 10. At 12:15, a figure emerged from the mist. It wasn't Dante. It was a young boy no older than 12, holding a silver coin. He held it out to me, his hand trembling. I took the coin and turned it over. It was Tails. He said to give you this, the boy whispered in broken English. And to tell you, the song is finished. My breath hitched. I looked at the coin, then at the dark, churning water of the Mediterranean. The silence was absolute. The man who had been my everything had made his final choice. He had given me the one thing I never thought I'd have, a future without a shadow. I stood at the edge of the world, the silver coin cold in my palm, and began to sing the lullaby one last time. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. I didn't leave Marseille. I moved into a small room above a bakery, the scent of yeast and salt my only companions. I didn't check the news. I didn't look for the agency. I lived as a ghost just as I had been trained. But every night I went to the lighthouse. And every night I left a single lavender sprig on the stone wall. A month passed. Then 2. The world moved on, the Moretti empire crumbling under the weight of the names I had leaked before the drive was destroyed. On a Tuesday, exactly 6 months after the night on the pier, the boy returned. He didn't have a coin this time. He had a key. The man, the boy said, pointing toward a sleek, white yacht anchored in the bay. He says the boat is ready. He says the bird needs to fly. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my veins. I ran to the docks, my feet barely touching the wood. I reached the yacht and climbed aboard, the deck polished and empty. I walked into the cabin, and there, sitting at the small table with 2 glasses of bourbon, was Dante. He looked older. A jagged scar ran from his ear to his throat, and his arm was in a sling. But his eyes, they were the color of aged bourbon and they were full of light. "You're late," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former self. I didn't say a word. I crossed the cabin and threw my arms around him, the scent of salt and expensive cologne finally bringing me home. "The coin was Tails," I whispered into his neck. Dante smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. "I never was very good at gambling, Elara. I cheated. It was Tails on both sides." He pulled me back and looked at me, a promise in his gaze. "The agency is gone. The family is gone. There's nothing left but the ocean and the song." He started the engine, the low hum a vibration of hope beneath our feet. We sailed out of the harbor, the lighthouse fading into the mist behind us. The story of the crime lord and the blind maid was over. The story of Elara and Dante was just beginning. The white yacht sliced through the Mediterranean, leaving a wake that looked like crushed diamonds under the moon. But the peace was a thin veneer. Dante sat at the helm, his hand gripping the wheel so tightly the leather creaked. He hadn't looked at me for an hour. The silence wasn't the romantic quiet of the French vineyard. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a man waiting for a bomb to detonate. "You didn't kill them all, did you?" I asked, standing in the companionway. The sea spray felt like needles against my skin. Dante didn't turn. I didn't have to. I just had to make them believe I was a bigger monster than the ones they were following. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone, its screen shattered. "The agency didn't stop because you melted the drive, Elara. They stopped because I gave them something better. I gave them my cousin Julian. I gave them the heir they actually wanted." The realization felt like a physical weight in my stomach. Dante hadn't just escaped, he had orchestrated a coup within the coup. He had traded his own blood to buy us this horizon. If you believe the price of freedom is never too high, hit the like button so Elara and Dante can finally outrun their ghosts. But the ocean has a way of reflecting the things we try to drown. On the third night, a light appeared on the radar, a fast-moving blip coming from the direction of the Italian coast. It wasn't a Coast Guard cutter. It was a black-clad interceptor, the kind the Moretti family used for special liquidations. Dante saw it and didn't reach for the radio. He reached for the heavy locker beneath the bench. He pulled out 2 tactical vests and a crate of flashbangs. "Julian didn't stay in the cage," Dante said, his voice as cold as the deep water below us. "He's coming to reclaim the throne. And he knows the only way to do that is to bring back my head, and yours." He handed me a compact submachine gun, its metal cold and indifferent. "This is it, Elara. The final movement of the song." I took the weapon, the weight familiar and hated. I had spent 6 months pretending to be a maid to avoid this moment, only to find myself standing on a deck in the middle of nowhere, waiting to become a killer again. The interceptor didn't signal. It rammed our stern, the impact throwing me against the bulkhead. The air was suddenly filled with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed fire. Glass shattered. The smell of salt was replaced by the acrid sting of gunpowder. Dante dived over the console, tackling a man who had jumped onto our deck. They spiraled into the darkness of the cockpit, a chaotic blur of limbs and steel. I stayed low, my ears tuning out the roar of the engines to find the heartbeat of the attack. I heard the scrape of a boot on the roof above me. I didn't look. I fired through the fiberglass ceiling. A heavy thud followed, then a splash as a body hit the water. But there were more. At least 4. I rolled into the galley, the narrow space offering cover. "Dante!" I screamed. I heard a grunt of pain, the sound of a blade finding bone. I stepped out, my weapon raised, and saw Julian. He was holding a knife to Dante's throat, his face a distorted mask of the man I had once shared dinner with. The maid with the gun, Julian spat, a thin trail of blood leaking from his nose. "You were always the favorite, weren't you? Dante would have burned the world for you. Now, I'm going to make him watch while I bury you in his ocean." He pressed the blade deeper, a red line appearing on Dante's neck. Dante looked at me, his eyes pleading. Not for his life. For the end. He wanted me to take the shot. Even if the bullet went through him to get to Julian. My hands didn't shake. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, hearing the rhythm of Julian's jagged breathing. I lowered the gun. "You don't want to kill her, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as the tide. "You want the encryption key. The one the agency couldn't crack. The one that unlocks the offshore accounts in Zurich." Julian paused, the greed in his eyes warring with his rage. "The song?" he whispered. "The key is the song." I took a step forward, the yacht tilting as a wave hit. "Let him go and I'll give it to you. Kill him and the music stops forever." Julian hesitated. In that second of greed, Dante moved. He slammed his elbow into Julian's ribs and spun away. I didn't wait. I fired a single, precise shot. Julian collapsed, the light fading from his eyes before he hit the deck. Silence returned to the yacht, save for the engine's dying moan. If you think Elara made the right choice to protect the man she loves, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. Dante slumped against the railing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Julian's body, then at me. "You lied," he whispered. "There is no key in the song anymore. You burned it." I walked over and knelt beside him, wiping the blood from his neck with my sleeve. "I know. But he didn't." I helped him stand, his weight heavy against me. We looked out at the dark water, the interceptor drifting away, its crew either dead or fled into the night. We reached a small, uninhabited island in the Aegean Sea 2 days later. We scuttled the yacht, watching as it sank into the turquoise depths, taking Julian and the last of the Moretti legacy with it. We walked onto the white sand with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the silver coin in my pocket. There were no cameras here. No agencies. No families. Just the sun, the salt, and a man and a woman who had finally run out of lies. Dante sat on a piece of driftwood, looking at his scarred hands. What now, Elara? No missions. No silver to polish. I sat beside him, leaning my head on his shoulder. I could hear his heart, a steady, calm rhythm that matched the waves. Now, I whispered, we learn how to live in the silence. I pulled the silver coin out and tossed it into the surf. I didn't look to see if it was heads or tails. It didn't matter anymore. The song was finished, and for the first time in my life I could hear the silence. And it was beautiful. The silence was a lie. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the breath the world took before screaming. On our 7th month on the island, the silence broke. It didn't start with a gunshot or a siren. It started with a vibration in the soles of my feet, the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a high-end submersible surfacing in the cove. I was standing in the surf, the salt water licking at my ankles, when the black hull breached the turquoise water like a prehistoric predator. Dante was on the porch of the driftwood cabin, his hand already hovering over the hollowed-out log where he kept the last of our hardware. Don't, I called out, my voice flat. I didn't need eyes to know who was coming. The frequency of that engine was a signature I had memorized in the academy. It was the eraser unit. The agency's final solution for assets that knew too much. The hatch hissed open, and a woman stepped onto the deck, her silhouette sharp against the blinding Aegean sun. It was Director Vance. The woman who had given me the Sophia Rossi file. You look well, Elara, Vance said, her voice carrying over the water with chilling clarity. The Mediterranean sun suits a traitor. Dante stepped off the porch, his limp barely visible now, his face a mask of granite. She's not a traitor, Vance. She's a ghost. And you don't hunt ghosts on their own ground. Vance stepped onto the sand, her heels sinking into the white powder. Behind her, 4 operatives emerged, their rifles held at low ready. If you believe Elara and Dante have earned their freedom and the agency should leave them in the past, hit the like button so their sanctuary stays hidden. Vance didn't come to kill us. She came because the world we thought we destroyed was growing back like a weed. The Moretti ledger you burned? It had a twin, Vance said, stopping 10 feet from me. A physical copy held in a Swiss vault by the matriarch, Dante's grandmother. She's emerged from hiding, and she's using the names on that list to blackmail the very heads of the agency that sent you in. They want her dead and they want the ledger. And they know only 2 people can get close enough to her to pull the trigger. Dante let out a sharp, jagged laugh. You want us to go back? After the harbor? After Julian? Vance looked at him, her eyes as cold as the deep sea. I'm not asking, Dante. The matriarch has already sent a team to this island. They're 4 hours behind me. If you don't come with us, you won't be fighting the agency. You'll be fighting a woman who views your survival as her greatest personal insult. I looked at Dante. I saw the shadow of the crime lord flicker in his eyes, the calculated, lethal man I had met in that rust-smelling kitchen. And then I saw the man who had shared his bread and his silence with me for 7 months. He didn't want the throne. But he wouldn't let the matriarch take our peace. We do it, I said, the words tasting like copper. But when it's over, the agency declares Elara and Dante Moretti officially deceased. No more ghosts. No more erasers. The flight to Zurich was a blur of steel and cold coffee. The matriarch's estate was a fortress carved into the side of a mountain, a place of glass and ice that smelled of old money and fresh blood. I wasn't the maid this time. I was the weapon. Dressed in a tactical suit that felt like a second skin, I moved through the ventilation shafts of the vault while Dante walked through the front door. He wasn't hiding. He was the distraction, the prodigal grandson returning to the den. Grandmother, I heard Dante's voice through my earpiece echoing in the grand hall below. I heard you were looking for me. I reached the grate above the vault. Below me, a woman with silver hair sat in a high-backed chair, a velvet box on her lap. She didn't look like a monster, she looked like an aristocrat waiting for tea. You always were the dramatic one, Dante, the matriarch replied. Where is your little spy? I was hoping to see the girl who broke your heart. She's closer than you think, I whispered to myself, sliding the grate aside. I dropped from the ceiling, silent as a snowflake, landing behind her. The operatives in the room raised their weapons, but Dante was faster. He pulled a concealed detonator from his sleeve. The floor is rigged with thermite, he said, his voice a low growl. Drop the guns or we all go down into the mountain together. The matriarch didn't flinch. She opened the velvet box. Inside wasn't a ledger. It was a single silver coin, identical to the one I had tossed into the Aegean. You think this is about money, Dante? Or names? she asked, a cruel smile touching her lips. This is about the blood. You broke the line. You chose a ghost over your family. She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the vault. Did he tell you, Elara? Did he tell you that the only way to activate the final offshore accounts is the death of the reigning Don? He didn't come here to save you. He came here to die so you could be rich. I looked at Dante. He didn't deny it. He stood there, the detonator in his hand, his eyes fixed on mine with a devastating, silent apology. The matriarch reached for a silent alarm on her chair. I had 3 seconds. I didn't fire at the guards. I didn't fire at the matriarch. I fired at the light fixture above the vault. The room plunged into absolute darkness. In the blackness, the matriarch was powerless. The guards were blind. But I was home. I moved through the room by the sound of their panicked breathing. I reached Dante first, grabbing his arm and dragging him toward the emergency exit. We're not doing it your way, I hissed. The sound of gunfire erupted behind us, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos like a strobe light. We burst through the heavy steel doors into the freezing mountain air, the wind howling through the pines. If you think Elara is the only one who can truly save Dante from his own dark legacy, hit the like button so they make it off the mountain. We didn't go back to Vance. We didn't go back to the agency. We stole a medical chopper from the helipad and flew it until the fuel light blinked red over the Italian Alps. We landed in a clearing where the snow was 6 feet deep and the air was too thin for secrets. I pushed Dante against the side of the chopper, the cold metal biting through my suit. Don't you ever try to die for me again, I said, my breath misting between us. Dante looked at me, the granite in his face finally cracking. I don't know how to be anything else, Elara. I was born a monster. I was raised to be a king. Being a sacrifice is the only thing left. I grabbed his collar, pulling his face inches from mine. You're not a king. And you're not a monster. You're the man who jumped into the harbor for a girl who didn't even have a name. That's the man I'm staying with. We walked away from the burning chopper, the fire a beacon in the white wilderness. The matriarch had her ledger. The agency had their scapegoat. And we had nothing but each other in the mountain. As the sun began to rise over the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold, I felt a familiar vibration in the air. Not a submersible. Not a drone. Just the wind. Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the lyrics to the song my mother had sung. He handed it to me. I found this in the matriarch's vault, he said. It wasn't a ledger she was holding. It was this. She knew it was the only thing you'd ever really want. I looked at the handwriting, it was my mother's. The final verse, the one I had forgotten, was written in bold ink. The bird doesn't fly to escape the storm, it flies to find the eye where the wind is still. I leaned my head on Dante's shoulder as we started the long walk down the mountain. We weren't going to an island. We weren't going to a city. We were just going. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't need a song to know the way. The silence wasn't a lie anymore. It was a promise. The mountain descent wasn't a retreat, it was an erasure. By the time we reached the Trilene, the medical chopper was a blackened skeleton against the peak, a funeral pyre for the names Elara and Dante. We found a shepherd's hut, a stone and timber relic that smelled of damp wool and ancient smoke. Dante collapsed against the doorframe, his breath a jagged rattle. The matriarch's revelation, the death clause in the accounts, hung between us like a poisoned mist. He had tried to be the hero by offering his life, failing to realize that his death would be my ultimate imprisonment. The matriarch won't stop, Dante rasped, his fingers digging into the rough wood of the hut. She doesn't want the money, Elara. She wants the order. She wants the world to believe the Morettis are eternal. I didn't answer. I was busy stripping the tactical gear, my skin steaming in the frigid air. I found an old wool blanket and draped it over his shoulders, my fingers lingering on the pulse point of his neck. It was steady, defiant. If you believe the only way to kill a legacy is to outlive the people who built it, hit the like button so their fire never goes out. The 8th month began in a coastal town in Montenegro, a place where the Adriatic Sea was so blue it looked like ink. We lived in a house with no mirrors. Dante spent his days fixing boat engines for the local fishermen, his hands permanently stained with grease and salt. I worked in the local infirmary, my heightened senses allowing me to diagnose heart murmurs and fevers before the machines could. We were nobody. We were the silence. But the eye of the storm is always a temporary gift. I was walking home from the infirmary when I heard the click, a sound so specific it made my lungs freeze. It was the safety of a suppressed SIG sour. Not from the agency. Not from the matriarch. This was the sound of a freelancer. I didn't turn around. I didn't reach for the knife in my boot. The cliffside path is dangerous this time of day, I said, my voice as calm as the water below. The shadows play tricks on the eyes. I don't need eyes to find a $5 million bounty, Elara, a voice replied, a gravelly London-born accent I hadn't heard since the academy. It was Silas, the man who had taught me how to disappear. He stepped out of the shadows, the barrel of his gun leveled at the base of my skull. The agency didn't declare you dead. They declared you open season. The matriarch put a price on your head that's making every ghost in Europe hungry. I felt the familiar hum of adrenaline, the Sophia Rossi mask sliding back into place. And Dante? Silas smirked, the scar on his lip twitching. Dante is a bonus. But the matriarch wants him alive. She wants to watch the butcher crawl back to the throne on his knees. I closed my eyes, tuning into the world around me. The wind was blowing from the west. A seagull was screaming above. And 40 yards away, behind a stone wall, I heard the rhythmic, heavy tread of a man with a limp. Dante wasn't at the docks. He had been trailing me since I left the infirmary. Silas, Dante's voice boomed from the shadows, you were always a better teacher than a hunter. Before Silas could pivot, the air was filled with the roar of a flare gun. The white light blinded the freelancer, the phosphorus burning a hole in the twilight. I dived for Silas's ankles, taking him down as Dante emerged from the stone ruins, a heavy iron wrench in his hand. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a desperate, ugly struggle on the edge of a cliff. We tied Silas to a rusted anchor in a hidden cove, the tide rising slowly around his boots. He laughed, a wet, hacking sound. You think killing me stops it? There are 12 more behind me. The matriarch leaked your biometrics to the dark net. You're not ghosts anymore. You're targets. Dante stood over him, the moonlight reflecting in his eyes, the eyes of the man who had burned an empire. Then let them come, Dante whispered. I've been looking for a reason to finish the job. If you believe that a man with nothing to lose is more dangerous than an army with everything to gain, drop a like so the world knows the butcher is back. We didn't run this time. We went to the one place the matriarch would never expect. Her own childhood home in the hills of Sicily. A crumbling villa surrounded by olive groves that hadn't seen a drop of rain in a decade. We spent 3 days turning the villa into a kill box. We used the old irrigation pipes to create a network of sonic sensors. We rigged the wine cellar with the last of the agency's C4. We didn't want to hide anymore. We wanted a final curtain. On the 4th night, the hunters arrived. 3 SUVs, black as hearses, winding up the dirt path. I stood on the balcony, the dress I wore, a simple black cotton, billowing in the dry wind. I didn't have a gun in my hand. I had a violin. I began to play the lullaby, the notes haunting and sharp, carrying over the groves like a funeral dirge. The hunters stopped. They didn't know if it was a trap or a ghost. She's there, one shouted, a red laser dot finding my chest. I didn't stop playing. I played the final verse, the one about the bird in the eye of the storm. As the hunters breached the front gates, Dante pulled the first trigger. The olive groves erupted in a wall of flame, the dry wood turning into a furnace. The sonic sensors triggered, a high-pitched frequency that sent the hunters to their knees, clutching their ears. I dropped the violin and picked up the rifle leaning against the railing. The song is over, I whispered. I didn't fire at the men. I fired at the fuel tanks of the SUVs. The explosion shook the mountain, a pillar of fire that could be seen from the coast. In the chaos, Dante moved through the smoke like the monster they feared he was. He didn't use a gun. He used the shadows. By dawn, the villa was a blackened husk and the hunters were gone. Only one person remained, the matriarch. She was sitting in the back of the last SUV, her silver hair covered in ash, her eyes wide with a terror she hadn't felt in 50 years. Dante opened the car door and looked at her. He didn't raise a hand. He just handed her the silver coin, now melted and distorted from the fire. The Moretti name died tonight, Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. If you ever mention Elara or the ledger again, I won't kill you. I'll make sure you live long enough to see every brick of your legacy turn to dust. He walked away, leaving her in the ruins of her childhood home. He came to me, his face covered in soot, his hand reaching for mine. We walked down the mountain as the sun rose, the air smelling of burnt olives and freedom. We didn't have a boat. We didn't have a plan. But for the first time in 9 months, the matriarch was silent. The agency was silent. The world was silent. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the rhythmic sound of our footsteps the only music I needed. What now? I asked. Dante squeezed my hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. Now, he said, we go find that bird. The one that doesn't need to fly anymore. The 10th month arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating, golden heat. We were in a nameless village on the edge of the Moroccan desert, a place where the sand swallowed secrets and the wind erased footprints. Dante's hands, once stained with the grease of boat engines, were now calloused from hauling water from the deep wells. I worked in the local market, my ears tracking the subtle shift in the marketplace, the way a merchant's breath hitched when a stranger approached, the way the stray dogs went silent when a black sedan rolled through the dust. The matriarch hadn't sent hunters this time. She had sent a message. It arrived in the form of a small wooden box left on our doorstep. Inside was no bomb, no coin, and no threat. It was a single dried lavender sprig from Provence and a wedding ring, my mother's ring stolen from the evidence locker at the agency. There was a note written in the matriarch's elegant razor-sharp script. Some debts can only be paid in blood. Others are paid in the truth of who we are. Come home, Elara. The final secret isn't in a vault. It's in your veins. If you believe that the truth is often more dangerous than a bullet, hit the like button so Elara finds the strength to face her past one last time. We didn't go to Sicily. We went to the heart of Rome, to a cathedral so old the stones seemed to weep. The matriarch was waiting in the confessional, her voice a hollow rasp behind the wooden screen. She wasn't an empress anymore, she was a dying woman clinging to a ghost. Your mother didn't run away because she loved a musician, Elara, she whispered. She ran because she was the one who built the ledger. She was the architect of the system that kept the Morettis in power. You aren't the hunter. You are the blueprint. The revelation shattered the last of the silence. My mother wasn't a victim, she was the creator. My blindness wasn't a tragedy, it was a side effect of the neural mapping experiments she had performed on herself to interface with the early versions of the Council's network. I stood in the dim light of the cathedral, my fingers tracing the cold stone of the altar. Dante stood at the heavy oak doors, his hand on his weapon, his eyes scanning the rafters for the agency snipers he knew were coming. The key isn't a song, Elara, the matriarch continued, her breath hitching. It's a biometric frequency that only your nervous system can produce. The offshore accounts don't just hold money. They hold the kill codes for every satellite and server the Council ever launched. You are the only person on Earth who can shut the world down, or start the fire that consumes it. The heavy doors of the cathedral burst open. The agency didn't want the ledger, they wanted the source. Director Vance walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking like a countdown timer. The matriarch has done her job, Vance said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She brought the blueprint home. Now, Elara, you're going to step into the machine and finish what your mother started. Or Dante dies right here on the consecrated ground he spent his life staining. I felt the heat of the red lasers finding my heart. I looked toward the doors. I couldn't see Dante, but I could hear his heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, and utterly unafraid. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had spent his life as a monster so I could be a ghost. Now he was ready to be a sacrifice so I could be free. The song is over, Vance, I said, my voice rising until it filled the cathedral. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small silver coin Dante had given me, the one that was tails on both sides. I didn't toss it. I crushed it. Beneath the silver was a tiny glass ampoule of the same biological agent the Council had tried to release in Moscow. The blueprint has a failsafe, I whispered. If the network tries to claim the architect burns the network. The silence that followed was absolute. Vance froze. The snipers in the rafters held their breath. I walked toward the doors, my hand finding Dante's. He took it, his grip like iron. We didn't look back at the matriarch or the director, or the throne that was waiting for a queen who refused to wear the crown. We walked out of the cathedral and into the blinding Roman sun. We disappeared into the crowds of the eternal city, two ghosts among millions. The agency couldn't touch us without risking the world. The matriarch couldn't find us without revealing her own sins. We weren't a crime lord and a blind maid anymore. We weren't a butcher and a wraith. We were just Elara and Dante, walking through a world that was finally truly silent. The final scene fades to a small, quiet house on the coast of Japan. The sound of the Pacific waves is a low, constant hum. I am sitting at a wooden table, my fingers tracing the scars on Dante's hand. He is reading a book, the pages turning with a soft, rhythmic snip. There are no guns here. No ledgers. No songs. Just the two of us, living in the eye of the storm we created. Do you hear that? Dante asks, his voice soft. I tilt my head, listening to the wind and the sea. Hear what? I ask. He leans in and kisses my forehead. Nothing, he whispers. Absolutely nothing. Subscribe if you believe that the greatest victory isn't winning the war, but finding a peace that the world can't take away.